They say justice is blind. What they don't tell you is that sometimes, justice is bought, sold, and carefully choreographed like a stage play where the ending is written before the curtain ever rises. My name is William Ashford, and I'm 73 years old. For 40 years, I taught mathematics at Jefferson High School. I specialized in probability theory and game theory, the study of strategic decision-making. My students used to joke that I could calculate the odds of anything. What they didn't know was that one day, I would use everything I'd learned to dismantle an entire conspiracy, piece by calculated piece. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where it all began, to the moment my world collapsed and my mind began working in ways I never imagined possible. What would you do if the system you trusted destroyed everything you loved? Would you accept it, or would you make them pay? It was a Tuesday morning in April when my grandson, Marcus, was arrested. He was 22 years old, fresh out of college with a degree in software engineering, and he had his whole life ahead of him. Marcus was brilliant, not just grandfather bias brilliant, but genuinely exceptional. He'd been recruited by 3 major tech companies before graduation. The charges were devastating: embezzlement of $2.3 million from Henderson and Associates, the prestigious accounting firm where he'd started working just 6 months earlier. I remember the phone call from my daughter Sarah, Marcus's mother. Her voice was shattered glass, each word cutting through the line. "Dad, they arrested Marcus. They're saying he stole millions. Dad, he didn't do it. I know my son. He didn't do it." I believed her immediately. Not because I was blinded by love, but because I knew Marcus. I'd spent countless hours with that boy, teaching him chess, discussing philosophy, helping him with his calculus homework. I knew the architecture of his mind, the structure of his morality. Marcus didn't have a dishonest bone in his body. But belief isn't evidence. And evidence, as I would soon learn, could be manufactured. The trial lasted 3 weeks. I attended every single day, sitting in the back row of that courtroom, watching, listening, and slowly beginning to notice things that didn't quite fit. Marcus's attorney was a public defender named Robertson, young, earnest, and completely outmatched. The prosecution was led by District Attorney Elizabeth Blackwood, a woman with political aspirations and a conviction rate that she wore like a crown. She was methodical, dramatic, and utterly convincing. The evidence against Marcus seemed damning. Financial records showed transfers from Henderson and Associates accounts to an offshore account linked to Marcus through a series of cryptocurrency transactions. Digital logs showed his credentials accessing the system at the exact times the transfers occurred. Even his own computer at work contained encrypted files with details of the scheme. But here's what nobody else noticed: 3 tiny details that would unravel everything. On day 4 of the trial, during a particularly tedious examination of financial records, I noticed the first anomaly. The prosecution's forensic accountant, a man named Gerald Foster, was presenting a timeline of transactions. He clicked through a PowerPoint presentation, and for just a moment, perhaps 3 seconds, a slide appeared that showed transaction timestamps. I wrote them down in my notebook. Years of teaching had trained me to spot patterns, and something about those timestamps bothered me. They were too regular. Too perfect. The transactions occurred at 2:47 a.m., 2:49 a.m., 2:51 a.m., and 2:53 a.m., exactly 2 minutes apart, like clockwork. But the prosecution claimed these were manual transfers that Marcus had executed. Any human being, even one being careful, would have some variation in timing. 2-minute intervals suggested automation, a script, a program. But when I mentioned this to Robertson during a recess, he nodded tiredly and said, Mr. Ashford, the prosecution argues that Marcus used automated scripts to execute the transfers. That's actually part of their case, that he was sophisticated enough to automate the crime. It was a good answer. But it didn't sit right with me. Something about it felt rehearsed, like Chen had been prepared for exactly this question. I filed it away in my mind and kept watching. On day 8, a digital forensics expert named Dr. Patricia Simmons testified for the prosecution. She was impressive, credentials from MIT, years of experience with the FBI, author of 2 books on cybercrime. She explained, in excruciating technical detail, how Marcus's credentials had been used to access the Henderson and Associates system. The access logs are irrefutable, she said, projecting them on the courtroom screen. These show Marcus Ashford's username and password accessing the financial transfer system on the dates in question. But then she said something that made my blood run cold. The access occurred from IP address 192.168.1.47, which we traced to Marcus Ashford's home network. I sat up straighter. As someone who taught myself computer networking to stay relevant in the modern world, I knew something that apparently nobody else in that courtroom did. 192.168.1.47 was a local network IP address, not a public one. It meant nothing without knowing the public IP address that the local network was behind. It was like saying, the crime occurred at apartment 47, without specifying which building, which street, which city. The statement was technically true but functionally meaningless as evidence. When I pointed this out to Chin during the next recess, he looked confused. But they traced it to his home network, he insisted. How? I asked. Did they subpoena his ISP for records matching that local IP to a public IP at those times? Chin stared at me blankly. Did Dr. Simmons explain the methodology for connecting that local IP to Marcus's actual physical location? I'll look into it, Chin said, but his voice had no conviction. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt something other than grief and shock. I felt anger. Cold, calculating anger. Someone was lying. The question was, who and why? You're about to discover how deep this conspiracy really went. Trust me, you won't see this coming. On day 12, the prosecution called their star witness, Richard Henderson himself, senior partner of Henderson and Associates. He was 60 years old, silver-haired, wearing a suit that probably cost more than my car. He spoke with the measured authority of someone accustomed to being believed without question. Marcus Ashford had access to our most sensitive financial systems, Henderson testified. We trusted him. I personally recommended him for the position after meeting him at a university career fair. To discover that he betrayed that trust, it's devastating. He looked directly at Marcus as he said this, and I saw something flicker across Henderson's face. It wasn't anger or disappointment. It was something else. Something that looked almost like satisfaction. I made a note. Henderson recommended Marcus for position. Why? The defense's case was weak. Chin called character witnesses, Marcus's professors, friends, family members. We all testified to his integrity, his intelligence, his honesty. But character witnesses don't outweigh digital evidence and financial records. The prosecution had built a fortress of data, and we were throwing pebbles at it. On day 17, I did something I'd never done before in my life. I skipped the afternoon session and went to the public library. I spent 4 hours researching Henderson and Associates, using databases and search engines to dig through news articles, business filings, and public records. What I found made the puzzle pieces start falling into place. 3 years earlier, Henderson and Associates had been investigated by the SEC for potential securities fraud. The investigation had been dropped, but not before several news articles mentioned that the firm had paid a $15 million settlement with no admission of wrongdoing. One of the investigating agents had given an anonymous quote to a financial blog. "They're good at making evidence disappear." 6 months before Marcus was hired, Henderson and Associates had brought on a new IT security director, a man named Cole Brennan, former military intelligence, with expertise in cybersecurity and digital forensics. And then I found the most interesting piece. Dr. Patricia Simmons, the prosecution's forensic expert, had previously been employed as a consultant for Henderson and Associates. It was buried in the acknowledgments section of her second book, thanking them for providing case study materials. Coincidence? Possibly. But I'd taught probability theory for 4 decades. I knew the odds of 3 convenient connections all pointing to the same firm. That night, I started building my own case file. I filled a notebook with timelines, connections, and questions. I wasn't a lawyer, and I wasn't an investigator. But I was a mathematician, and mathematics is the language of truth. If there was a pattern here, I would find it. On day 19, the jury deliberated for 7 hours. When they returned, Marcus stood with his shoulders back, trying to be brave. My daughter sat beside me, gripping my hand so hard I lost feeling in my fingers. "Guilty on all counts." The words landed like hammer blows. Marcus's face crumbled. Sarah screamed. Robert Chin stared at his notes, defeated. The judge sentenced Marcus to 15 years in federal prison. I sat there in that courtroom, watching my grandson being led away in handcuffs, and I made a decision. A cold, mathematical decision based on probability, evidence, and absolute certainty. They had framed him. And I was going to prove it. But more than that, I was going to destroy them. This is where a retired math teacher becomes the most dangerous opponent they never saw coming. I had advantages that Marcus's attorney didn't have. I was retired, which meant I had time. I was methodical, which meant I had patience. And I was angry, which meant I had motivation that wouldn't fade. But most importantly, I was underestimated. Nobody looks at a 73-year-old former high school teacher and sees a threat. That was their first mistake. I started by creating what I called my truth matrix, a spreadsheet that listed every piece of evidence presented at trial, cross-referenced with verification sources, timestamps, and probability assessments. For each piece of evidence, I asked 3 questions. Could this be fabricated? Who would benefit from fabrication? What would be required to fabricate it? The cryptocurrency transfers were interesting. The prosecution claimed Marcus had set up the offshore accounts using a series of intermediaries to hide his identity. But cryptocurrency transactions are public. I spent 3 days learning how to use blockchain explorers, tracing the transaction history. What I found was fascinating. The wallet that received the stolen funds had been created 14 months before Marcus was even hired at Henderson and Associates. It had received several test transactions in small amounts, $100, $250, $500, before the large transfers occurred. This was significant. If Marcus had created the wallet, why would he have done so more than a year before he had access to the funds? And why make test transactions that could potentially be traced back to him? I documented everything with screenshots and timestamps. Next, I focused on Dr. Simmons's testimony about the IP addresses. I filed a Freedom of Information Act request for any records the prosecutor's office had regarding the IP trace. It took 6 weeks, but I finally received a heavily redacted document that confirmed my suspicion, They had never actually traced the local IP to Marcus's physical location. They'd simply asserted it. I made a note. Testimony presented as fact was actually assumption or fabrication. Then I turned my attention to the encrypted files found on Marcus's work computer. According to the prosecution, these files contain details of the embezzlement scheme, including account numbers, transfer schedules, and passwords. But here was the thing: encryption has a timestamp. Files encrypted with modern algorithms include metadata about when the encryption occurred. I filed a motion through Chin, who was handling Marcus's appeal, to request the full forensic image of the computer for independent analysis. The prosecution fought this request for 3 months. When they finally released it, it was because a judge ordered them to. And when I hired an independent forensic expert to examine it, using money from my retirement savings, we found something extraordinary. The encrypted files had been created 3 days before Marcus was arrested. Not over the 6-month period when the embezzlement allegedly occurred, but in a single batch, 3 days before everything fell apart. Someone had planted evidence on his computer. Hook, but discovering evidence of a frame-up is one thing. Proving who did it, and why, that's where things get really interesting. I spent my days at the library, using public computers to research everything I could find about the key players. I learned to use social media like an investigator, finding connections that existed just below the surface. Cole Brennan, Henderson and Associates IT Security Director, had worked in military intelligence for 12 years before entering the private sector. His expertise was in cyber warfare, specifically in creating false digital trails to conceal military operations. He'd even published an academic paper on it in a defense journal. Attribution manipulation in cyber operations. In other words, he was an expert in framing people for crimes they didn't commit. I made a note. Brennan has exact skills needed to fabricate digital evidence against Marcus. Then I researched Gerald Foster, the forensic accountant. He had testified at 12 cases for the district attorney's office in the past 3 years, with an 11-to-1 conviction rate. But when I dug deeper, I found something interesting. In 5 of those cases, defendants had later claimed evidence was fabricated. In one case, these claims had led to an internal investigation by the State Bar Association, but it had been dropped due to insufficient evidence. Foster had also done consulting work for Henderson and Associates 2 years ago. Every thread I pulled led back to the same place. I created a network diagram, the kind I used to draw for my students when teaching them about mathematical graphs and connections. In the center, Henderson and Associates. Radiating outward Dr. Simmons, Cole Brennan, Gerald Foster, and D.A. Elizabeth Blackwood, who had received campaign contributions from Richard Henderson totaling $75,000 over the past 4 years. The picture was becoming clearer. But I still didn't know the why. Why frame Marcus? What was the motive? Marcus had been calling me once a week from prison. The conversations were monitored, so we kept them generic. Discussions about family, memories, hopes for the appeal. But during one call, Marcus said something that caught my attention. "Grandpa, I keep thinking about that last project I was working on at Henderson. The audit system. I was so close to finishing it." After we hung up, I sat in my small apartment, thinking. Marcus had mentioned the audit system before, but I'd never paid much attention. I called Sarah and asked her if Marcus had kept any personal notes or documents about his work. "He kept a journal," she said. "Just a notebook where he wrote down ideas and problems he was trying to solve. The police took his computer, but they didn't take the notebook. I have it in a box of his things." 2 hours later, I was sitting at Sarah's kitchen table, reading through Marcus's careful handwriting. Most of it was technical, code snippets, algorithm designs, database schemas. But on a page dated 6 weeks before his arrest, I found this. Discovered discrepancy in partner distribution accounts. Numbers don't match reported figures by approximately $2. 1 million over past 18 months. Asked Henderson about it. He said it was a reporting error, and he'd look into it. Seemed nervous. Cole Brennan asked me detailed questions about what I'd found and how I'd found it. Said it was for security audit purposes. My hands started shaking. Marcus hadn't stolen $2. 3 million. He'd discovered that someone else had. And that someone had framed him to cover their tracks. Hook, you think you know where this is going. You don't. Because what I did next, nobody saw coming. I was 73 years old. I had no legal authority, no badge, no power. But I had something more valuable. I had time, intelligence, and absolute determination. I spent 2 months planning. I couldn't go to the police. They'd already built their case, and confirmation bias would make them dismiss anything I presented. I couldn't go to the media. I had no proof yet, just connections and suspicions. And I couldn't hire a private investigator. I'd depleted most of my savings on the independent forensic analysis. No, I needed to do this myself. And I needed to be smarter than all of them. I thought about game theory, specifically, about information asymmetry. My opponents thought the game was over. They believed Marcus was convicted, the case was closed, and they were safe. But I was still playing, and they didn't know it. That was my advantage. My plan had 3 phases. Phase 1, infiltration. Phase 2, documentation. Phase 3, detonation. For Phase 1, I needed to get inside Henderson and Associates. Not physically, that would be impossible, but digitally. I needed access to their systems, their files, their communications. This is where being underestimated became my greatest weapon. The Trojan horse. Henderson and Associates was always looking for experienced bookkeepers to handle their older clients, wealthy individuals who preferred dealing with someone their own age. I applied for a part-time consultant position, emphasizing my 40 years of experience teaching mathematics and my expertise in financial calculations. They hired me within 2 weeks. I was careful. Perfectly careful. I was the friendly grandfather, grateful for the work, eager to help. I asked simple questions, made small mistakes that required IT help, and slowly learned the architecture of their systems. Cole Brennan set up my credentials personally. He was professional but cold, explaining the security protocols with the bored efficiency of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. He had no idea he was giving access to his own worst nightmare. For the first month, I did nothing but my assigned work. I was meticulous, reliable, and utterly boring. I wanted to be invisible, forgettable, part of the furniture. But I was watching, learning, documenting. The office used an internal communication system for messages between partners and senior staff. I noticed that Cole Brennan had administrative access to the system. He could read any message, anytime. I also noticed that the system logged every access, every login, every file opened. One evening, working late, I'd volunteered to help catch up on some backlog. I deliberately triggered a minor error in my account by trying to access a folder I didn't have permission for. This generated an automatic IT support ticket. Cole came to my desk 20 minutes later. Mr. Ashford, I see you tried to access the partner distribution files. That's above your access level. I played confused, apologetic. Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry. I must have clicked the wrong folder. These computers are still so confusing to me. He smiled, The patient smile people give to elderly people they consider harmless. No problem. Let me adjust your interface to make it clearer. While he worked on my computer, I watched carefully. He entered his administrator password. I have an excellent memory for patterns and numbers. It's one of the benefits of teaching mathematics for 4 decades. I couldn't see the exact keys he pressed, but I could see the rhythm, the pattern of his fingers. 8 characters. 2 capital letters. 4 numbers. 2 symbols. After he left, I sat at my desk for 10 more minutes, thinking about what I'd seen. Then I opened a calculator and started working through probability distributions. Hook, what I'm about to tell you will show you exactly how dangerous a patient, intelligent person can be. Phase 2, the collection. Over the next 3 months, I became part of the office landscape. I brought in homemade cookies. I asked about people's families. I attended the holiday party and told stories about my years as a teacher. Everyone liked William, the friendly grandfather who was helping out part-time. And while they liked me, I was methodically collecting every piece of information I needed. I learned that Cole Brennan always used the same coffee cup, a large travel mug with a lid. One Monday morning, I arrived early and placed a tiny piece of clear tape over the lip of his mug where he'd drink from. At the end of the day, after he'd left, I retrieved the tape. Fingerprints. I learned that every Thursday, Cole attended a cybersecurity meetup downtown. I followed him once, staying at a distance, and watched him interact with other tech professionals. He was arrogant, dismissive, the kind of person who believed he was the smartest person in every room. Arrogance is a vulnerability. I learned that Gerald Foster, the forensic accountant, still did occasional consulting work for Henderson and Associates. He came to the office once a month to review certain accounts. I made sure to be working late on one of those nights, and I observed which files he accessed, which reports he generated. Most importantly, I learned about the partner distribution system, the same system Marcus had been investigating. It was complex, deliberately opaque, designed to obscure exactly where money was flowing. But complexity is just another form of pattern, and I was excellent at finding patterns. I couldn't access the system directly, but I could see enough through my legitimate work to understand its structure. The discrepancy Marcus had found wasn't a simple theft. It was more sophisticated than that. Henderson and Associates managed funds for several high-net-worth individuals. When these clients paid fees, the money flowed through a series of internal accounts before being distributed to the partners. But someone had created a subtle skim, a fraction of a percent diverted from multiple transactions, small enough to avoid detection individually but adding up to millions over time. The money flowed into an account labeled Operating Reserve Fund, which sounded legitimate. But that account then made periodic transfers to the offshore cryptocurrency wallet, the same wallet that had been attributed to Marcus. And every transfer was authorized by credentials belonging to Richard Henderson himself. Marcus hadn't stolen anything. Richard Henderson had. And when Marcus discovered the discrepancy, Henderson had used Cole Brennan's expertise to frame him, Dr. Simmons's credibility to sell the frame up, and D.A. Blackwood's ambition to prosecute it. Hook, but here's what they didn't know. I wasn't just gathering evidence. I was building a trap. I couldn't access the partner distribution system with my credentials, and I couldn't hack it, even if I had the skills, which I didn't. Any unauthorized access would leave logs that Cole Brennan would spot immediately. But I didn't need to hack the system. I just needed Henderson to access it himself while I watched. I'd learned something useful during my months at Henderson and Associates. Richard Henderson had a pattern. Every Friday at 4 p.m., he reviewed the week's financial distributions from his office. He was a creature of habit, predictable to the minute. I also learned that the office had an old practice of using desktop computers rather than laptops for partners, citing security concerns. These computers were on a local network, and while the network was secure, it still had to route through physical infrastructure. One Thursday evening, I stayed late again. The office was empty except for the cleaning crew, who knew me as the friendly old man who sometimes worked late. I'd chatted with them often enough that they didn't question my presence. I went to the network closet, a small room that housed the servers and routing equipment. The door was locked, but I'd watched the cleaning crew open it weeks ago. They used the key hanging on their supervisor's belt, and I'd memorized its shape. For $15, I'd had a copy made at a hardware store, telling the clerk I'd lost my shed key. Inside the closet, I installed a small device I bought online, a network tap, designed for IT professionals to monitor traffic. It was passive, wouldn't trigger any security alerts, and would record all data flowing through the network. The next day, Friday, I worked at my desk as usual. At 4 p.m., Richard Henderson accessed the partner distribution system from his office computer, and my network tap recorded everything. That evening, I retrieved the device, went home, and spent the entire weekend analyzing the captured data. The encryption was strong, but Henderson's session included the handshake protocols, the authentication tokens, everything I needed to understand exactly how he accessed the system and what he'd accessed. The logs showed him reviewing transfer records, including the ones to the operating reserve fund. More importantly, they showed him accessing files labeled MB_evidence_package and forensic_backup_files. He was maintaining insurance, copies of the fabricated evidence used to frame Marcus, probably to ensure everyone involved stayed quiet. I documented everything with screenshots, timestamps, and detailed notes. But I still needed more. I needed proof that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. Every criminal makes one crucial mistake. Henderson's was that he trusted Cole Brennan completely. Cole Brennan was brilliant, arrogant, and sloppy. Not sloppy in his technical work, but sloppy in his human interactions. He believed his technical superiority made him invulnerable, which meant he didn't guard his conversations carefully. I'd noticed that Cole often had phone conversations in the break room, believing it was secure because it had no computers or recording devices. What he didn't consider was that a 73-year-old man sitting in the break room drinking coffee and reading a newspaper wasn't a threat. Over several months, I heard fragments of conversations. Most were technical discussions with contractors or vendors. But occasionally, there were calls that were different, more cautious. Using phrases like, "The package we delivered," and "The subject is secure." One Friday in November, I was in the break room when Cole received a call. He seemed agitated. "No, the forensic image is sealed with the court. Nobody can access it without another order." I know. But the appeal is going nowhere. Schön is incompetent, and even if he wasn't, we covered everything. Yes, the files will self-destruct if anyone tries to access them improperly. I built in a failsafe. Henderson is happy. The DA is happy. Simmons got her bonus. Everyone wins. He paused, listening. Look, the old case is dead. The SEC dropped it. Henderson paid the settlement. And now we have a perfect patsy sitting in prison. Nobody is looking at us. Another pause. Fine. But after this, we're done. No more projects like this. The risk isn't worth it. He hung up, muttered something under his breath, and left the break room. I sat there, my hands shaking slightly, my newspaper forgotten. He just confirmed everything. But confirmation wasn't enough. I needed to get them to expose themselves. This is where 40 years of teaching game theory paid off in ways none of them could imagine. The beautiful thing about arrogance is that it makes people predictable. If you understand someone's ego, you understand their weaknesses. Cole Brennan believed he was untouchable because of his technical expertise. Richard Henderson believed he was untouchable because of his wealth and connections. Elizabeth Blackwood believed she was untouchable because of her conviction record and political trajectory. They were all wrong. My plan required 3 elements: bait, pressure, and documentation. I needed to create a situation where they would panic and, in their panic, expose themselves. For the bait, I used Marcus's appeal. Robert Chin had filed an appeal based on ineffective counsel, arguing that he hadn't adequately defended Marcus. It was a weak argument, and everyone knew it. But I convinced Chin to add something else to the appeal, a request for a full forensic re-examination of the digital evidence, specifically focusing on metadata and file creation timestamps. Chin was skeptical. "Mr. Ashford, we already reviewed the forensic image. The prosecution will argue that we had our chance." "File it anyway," I insisted. "And make sure it gets media coverage. Contact reporters. Make it a story about potential wrongful conviction. But we don't have proof of wrongful conviction. Not yet. But we will." Chin filed the appeal with the additions I requested. I then did something I'd never done before. I created a fake social media account and started posting about Marcus's case, framing it as a possible wrongful conviction involving planted digital evidence. I knew Cole Brennan monitored social media for potential security threats. I knew he'd see the posts. And I knew he'd panic. For the pressure, I sent anonymous packages. To Dr. Patricia Simmons, I sent a copy of her own book with a page marked, "The Acknowledgements thanking Henderson and Associates." Attached was a simple note: "Conflicts of interest should be disclosed during testimony. Someone remembers." To Gerald Foster, I sent copies of news articles about the previous cases where defendants had alleged fabricated evidence, with his name highlighted. The note read, "Patterns emerge when you look carefully. Someone is looking." To Elizabeth Blackwood, I sent a detailed timeline showing her campaign contributions from Richard Henderson, cross-referenced with cases she'd prosecuted where Henderson and Associates was involved. No note necessary. And to Richard Henderson, I sent a single sheet of paper with a number: $2,127,549.32. The exact amount Marcus had identified as missing. Below it, "Mathematics doesn't lie. But accountants do." I mailed these anonymously from different post offices, wearing gloves, using printed labels. Untraceable. What happened next proved that when you corner dangerous people, they become reckless. Within a week of sending the packages, things started happening. Dr. Simmons called the district attorney's office demanding to speak with Elizabeth Blackwood. I know this because I'd become friendly with one of the administrative assistants at Henderson and Associates, who had a friend working in the DA's office. Information flows through human networks, and I'd spent months building mine. Cole Brennan started running security audits on the office systems, looking for evidence of hacking or unauthorized access. He found nothing. My network tap had been passive and brief, and I'd removed it months ago. Gerald Foster requested a meeting with Richard Henderson. They met for 3 hours in Henderson's office with the door closed. And Elizabeth Blackwood started making calls to judges, prosecutors, and police detectives involved in the original case. She was checking for leaks, trying to understand how someone might have obtained detailed information about the investigation. I watched all of this unfold like a chess master watching opponents realize they're in check. But I wasn't done yet. In December, I did something that required every ounce of courage I possessed. I went to Richard Henderson's office and requested a private meeting. His secretary tried to put me off, but I insisted. Tell him it's about the Marcus Ashford case. Tell him I have information he needs to hear. 10 minutes later, I was sitting across from Richard Henderson in his expensive office with its view of the city skyline. He studied me with cold eyes. Mr. Ashford. William, isn't it? You're Marcus Ashford's grandfather. I am. And you've been working here for 6 months now? 7, actually. Something flickered in his expression. The beginning of realization. Why? I smiled, not a warm smile, but a cold, mathematical one. Because I needed to understand what happened to my grandson. And now I do. I don't know what you think you've discovered. I interrupted him. In all my years of teaching, I'd learned when to let students struggle and when to give them the answer. This was an answer moment. You've been skimming from your clients' accounts for at least 2 years. Small amounts, fractions of percentages, routed through the operating reserve fund to an offshore cryptocurrency wallet. Marcus discovered the discrepancy. So you had Cole Brennan frame him, using his military intelligence expertise to create false digital evidence. Dr. Simmons provided expert testimony without disclosing her previous relationship with your firm. Gerald Foster provided forensic accounting that failed to identify the real theft. And DA Elizabeth Blackwood, motivated by your campaign contributions and her own ambition, prosecuted an innocent man. Henderson's face had gone pale, then red. These are serious accusations. Do you have any idea what kind of legal trouble you're inviting? Yes, I said calmly. I taught probability theory for 40 years. I understand risk assessment better than most. And I understand that you're currently calculating whether it's riskier to let me walk out of here or to do something to stop me. Get out of my office. I will. But first, let me tell you what's going to happen. You're going to panic. You're going to contact Cole, Simmons, Foster, and Blackwood. You're going to discuss how to handle this situation. And in doing so, you're going to create exactly the evidence pattern that will destroy all of you. I stood up. Game theory, Mr. Henderson. Once your opponents know you're aware of their strategy, every move they make to protect themselves actually exposes them further. I learned that lesson well. I hope you do too. I walked out of his office, my heart pounding, my hands steady. Behind me, I knew the dominoes were starting to fall. But here's what Henderson didn't know. I'd just activated the final phase of my plan. Phase 3 detonation. For the next 2 weeks, I stopped going to Henderson and Associates. I called in sick, sent friendly messages to my supervisor, and stayed completely invisible. But I wasn't idle. I'd built a website, a simple, clean site that documented everything. Every connection, every piece of evidence, every timeline. I included the metadata analysis of the planted files, the network logs showing Henderson accessing the evidence packages, the photos I'd taken of documents, the recorded timestamps of Cole's phone conversations. I'd bought a voice recorder and kept it in my pocket during those break room sessions. I included the pattern of perfect 2-minute intervals in the transaction timestamps, the IP address testimony that was technically meaningless, the prior relationship between Dr. Simmons and Henderson and Associates. Everything was cited, sourced, and documented with the same rigor I'd applied to 40 years of teaching. But I didn't publish the website yet. First, I needed one more piece, proof of the conspiracy to cover up. I'd guessed, correctly, that after my meeting with Henderson, he would convene an emergency meeting with his co-conspirators. I'd also guessed that Cole Brennan, being technical and paranoid, would insist on electronic communication being minimized. So they'd have to meet in person. I knew Henderson owned a vacation property in the mountains, about 2 hours outside the city. I'd learned this from casual conversation in the office. I also knew, from public records, that the property had been purchased through a shell company, the kind of privacy measure wealthy people use. It was a calculated risk, but I had spent months calculating risks. I rented a car, paying cash, using a fake name I'd created with a prepaid card, and drove to the mountains. I found Henderson's property easily enough. It was isolated, private, exactly the kind of place you'd choose for a meeting you didn't want anyone to know about. I parked a quarter-mile away and hiked through the woods. At 73, I wasn't as spry as I once was, but determination has a way of making the body cooperate. I'd brought binoculars, a high-quality voice recorder, and a camera with a telephoto lens, tools I'd purchased over months from different stores, always with cash. The property had large windows. Wealthy people love their views, and views work both ways. On the third night of watching, they arrived. Richard Henderson came first, in his Mercedes. Then Cole Brennan in a BMW. Dr. Patricia Simmons in an Audi. Gerald Foster in a Lexus. And finally, in a black SUV with tinted windows, District Attorney Elizabeth Blackwood. I photographed every arrival. Timestamp, license plate, clear facial identification. They met in Henderson's living room, and because they felt safe in this isolated location, they didn't close the curtains. I set up my equipment on a ridge overlooking the property, about 150 yards away. The recorder I'd purchased was designed for wildlife observation. It could pick up conversations through windows at significant distances. I tested it once, listening through headphones. Perfect clarity. For the next 3 hours, I recorded everything. What they said in that room would end all of their careers. And I captured every single word. "We have a problem," Henderson began. "Marcus Ashford's grandfather has been working at my firm for 7 months. He confronted me 2 weeks ago with detailed knowledge of the scheme. How much does he know?" Blackwood's voice was sharp, prosecutorial even here. "Everything. The discrepancy Marcus found, the offshore accounts, the framing. He knows about Cole's involvement, Simmons's testimony, Foster's reports. All of it." Silence. Then Cole Brennan. "How is that possible? We covered everything. The evidence was airtight." "Apparently not airtight enough," Henderson snapped. "The old man is smarter than he looks. What did you tell him?" This was Simmons, her voice trembling slightly. "Nothing. I told him to get out. But the damage is done. He knows." "Can we discredit him?" Foster asked. "He's an elderly man, retired teacher, emotionally invested in his grandson's innocence. We can paint him as delusional, conspiracy-minded." "That won't work," Brennan interrupted. "If he's been working at Henderson and Associates for 7 months, he's had access. He could have gathered evidence. Real evidence." "What kind of evidence?" Blackwood demanded. Brennan stood up, pacing. "Network logs. File access records. Financial documents. Hell, he could have installed monitoring equipment. We need to assume worst-case scenario." "Which is?" Simmons asked. "Which is that he has proof." "Enough proof to reopen the case, trigger an investigation, maybe even flip the conviction." Another silence. Longer this time. Henderson broke it. "Then we need to be proactive. Elizabeth, can you block any appeal attempts?" "I'm already working on it," Blackwood said. "But if he has real evidence, if he goes to the media or to federal investigators, I can't protect us." My office investigated and prosecuted the case. If it comes out that the evidence was fabricated, I'm finished. We're all finished. We stick to the story, Henderson said firmly. The evidence against Marcus Ashford was legitimate. He was convicted by a jury of his peers. Nothing has changed. Except that his grandfather knows the truth, Foster pointed out. And he's had 7 months to prepare. Then we make sure he can't present whatever he thinks he has, Brennan said. His voice had turned cold, calculating. We discredit him first. We make him look unstable. We do nothing illegal. Blackwood interrupted sharply. I won't risk my career on witness tampering or worse. Then what do you suggest? Henderson asked acidly. I suggest we lawyer up and prepare for the worst. If this goes public, we need the best defense attorneys money can buy. We claimed the evidence was legitimate, the conviction was sound, and this is just a desperate family member refusing to accept reality. That might work for you, Simmons said bitterly. You were doing your job as a prosecutor. But I testified as an expert witness. If it comes out that I had prior connections to Henderson and Associates and didn't disclose them, I lose my credibility, my career, everything. Then you should have thought about that before you agreed to help, Henderson said coldly. The conversation continued for another hour, covering contingencies, discussing strategies, arguing about risk and exposure. But they'd already given me everything I needed. They'd confessed to framing Marcus. On tape. In their own words. I packed up my equipment as quietly as I'd arrived and hiked back through the dark woods to my car. My hands were steady. My mind was clear. I'd been patient. I'd been thorough. And now, I was ready to end this. Hook, imagine waking up one morning to discover your entire conspiracy exposed to the world. That's what happened to them. On a Monday morning in January, I published the website. I'd registered the domain through an anonymous service. The hosting was overseas, protected by privacy laws. The website was called The Marcus Ashford Case, a Study in Wrongful Conviction. It contained everything. The metadata analysis showing files were created days before Marcus's arrest. The network logs showing Henderson accessing evidence packages. Photos of documents I'd photographed at Henderson and Associates. The timeline of connections between all 5 conspirators. The analysis of the transaction timestamps showing impossible regularity. The breakdown of Dr. Simmons's testimony about IP addresses. The SEC investigation documents about Henderson and Associates. Campaign contribution records linking Blackwood to Henderson. And most damning of all, the complete audio recording of their meeting at Henderson's mountain property, with professional transcription. I didn't editorialize. I didn't add emotional appeals. I just presented the evidence, organized chronologically, cited meticulously, like a mathematical proof. Then I sent the link to 50 people. Every major newspaper in the state. The FBI's White-Collar Crime Division. The State Attorney General's Office. The State Bar Association. 3 National Innocence Projects. Marcus's appellate attorney. And, just for symmetry, Richard Henderson, Cole Brennan, Patricia Simmons, Gerald Foster, and Elizabeth Blackwood themselves. The subject line was simple. Evidence of conspiracy to frame Marcus Ashford. What happened in the next 72 hours was nothing short of spectacular. The media picked it up first. By Monday afternoon, it was the top story on 3 local news channels. By Tuesday morning, it had gone national. By Wednesday, it was trending on social media. The audio recording was the nuclear bomb that destroyed everything in its path. You could hear their voices, clear and identifiable, discussing how to cover up the frame-up, how to discredit me, how to protect themselves. We stick to the story. The evidence against Marcus Ashford was legitimate. If he has real evidence, if he goes to the media or to federal investigators, I can't protect us. The old man is smarter than he looks. Those sound bites played on loop across every news network. The FBI opened an investigation on Tuesday. Not into Marcus, into Henderson and Associates, Cole Brennan, Patricia Simmons, Gerald Foster, and Elizabeth Blackwood. The State Bar Association announced they were reviewing Dr. Simmons's testimony for ethical violations. The Attorney General called for a special prosecutor to investigate potential criminal conspiracy charges. Elizabeth Blackwood held a press conference on Wednesday, her face ashen, insisting she had prosecuted the case in good faith based on evidence presented to her. But when reporters asked about the campaign contributions from Henderson, about the audio recording, about why she'd been at Henderson's mountain property discussing the case, she had no good answers. She resigned on Thursday. Richard Henderson released a statement through his attorneys denying all allegations. But by Friday, 3 of his clients had withdrawn their accounts, citing concerns about fiduciary responsibility. By the following Monday, it was 12 clients. Within a month, Henderson and Associates was bankrupt. Cole Brennan disappeared. Literally. He left the country, reportedly to a nation with no extradition treaty. The FBI issued a warrant for his arrest on charges of conspiracy, wire fraud, and obstruction of justice. Dr. Patricia Simmons held a press conference where she cried and apologized and claimed she'd been misled about the evidence. But the recordings didn't lie. She'd known exactly what she was doing. Her academic credentials were revoked by MIT. Her books were pulled by publishers. Her expert testimony in 11 other cases was now under review. Gerald Foster was arrested on 6 counts of falsifying documents and conspiracy. He tried to claim he'd simply made errors in his analysis, but prosecutors had the audio recording of him discussing the package we delivered. And Marcus? This is the moment that made everything worth it. On February 14th, Valentine's Day, of all days, a judge granted an emergency hearing based on the new evidence. Marcus was brought from prison, thin and hollow-eyed but with hope rekindled. Robert Chin, who'd been Marcus's inadequate public defender, sat at the defense table looking stunned. The case he'd failed to win properly was now winning itself through evidence he'd never known existed. The prosecutor, not Blackwood, who'd resigned, but a new special prosecutor appointed by the Attorney General, stood before the judge and said words I'll never forget. Your Honor, after reviewing the evidence presented by Mr. William Ashford and conducting our own investigation, the state concedes that the evidence used to convict Marcus Ashford was fabricated. We move for immediate dismissal of all charges and full exoneration of the defendant. The judge looked at Marcus. Mr. Ashford, you have been the victim of a terrible miscarriage of justice. On behalf of this court, I apologize. All charges are dismissed. You are free to go. Marcus stood there, not quite believing it. Then he looked back at me, sitting in the courtroom gallery, and our eyes met. I nodded once. Just once. He was free. The fallout continued for months. Richard Henderson was indicted on 47 counts including embezzlement, conspiracy, fraud, and obstruction of justice. The trial hasn't happened yet, but with the evidence against him, including his own recorded voice, his attorneys are negotiating a plea deal. He'll likely spend the rest of his life in prison. Cole Brennan remains at large, but international warrants have been issued. Sooner or later, he'll surface. Men like him always do. They can't resist their own arrogance. Patricia Simmons accepted a plea deal, 5 years in prison in exchange for testimony against Henderson and Brennan. She'll never work as an expert witness again. Her reputation is destroyed beyond repair. Gerald Foster is awaiting trial. His attorney is arguing diminished culpability, that he was following Henderson's instructions, but the recordings show he was a willing, active participant. He'll likely serve 8 to 10 years. Elizabeth Blackwood wasn't charged criminally. Prosecutors determined she'd been used by the conspirators rather than being an active participant. But her political career is over. She'll never be a district attorney again, let alone the attorney general or governor she'd aspired to become. Marcus received a formal exoneration and a settlement from the state, $4.5 million for wrongful imprisonment. It won't give him back the year he lost, the trauma he endured, but it's a start. He's rebuilding his life now. He got a job at a tech company that specifically recruits people who've been wrongfully convicted, giving them second chances. He's started speaking at Innocence Project events, telling his story, helping others. And me? You want to know what happens to a 73-year-old retired math teacher who takes down an entire criminal conspiracy? Let me tell you. I'm 74 now. Still living in my small apartment. Still drinking coffee in the mornings and doing crossword puzzles in the evenings. But I get letters. Dozens of them, from all over the country. From people who've been wrongfully convicted, from families fighting the system, from lawyers working on innocence cases. They ask for advice. They ask for help. They ask how I did it. I tell them the same thing I told my students for 40 years. Mathematics is the language of truth. Patterns don't lie. Evidence doesn't lie. If you're patient enough, thorough enough, and smart enough to see the connections others miss, you can solve any problem. I also tell them that justice isn't a system, it's a series of decisions made by flawed human beings. Those humans can be corrupted, manipulated, or simply wrong. But they can also be convinced by irrefutable evidence, if you present it properly. And I tell them that being underestimated is the greatest advantage you can have. Let people think you're just a harmless old man. Let them dismiss you. Let them ignore you. While they're not paying attention, you can dismantle their entire world, piece by piece, with nothing but patience and intelligence. The news media called me a hero. Some called me a vigilante. The Innocence Projects want me to consult on cases. Universities want me to lecture on wrongful convictions. But I'm not a hero. I'm just a grandfather who loved his grandson enough to learn skills I never thought I'd need, to take risks I never thought I'd take, and to be colder and more calculating than I ever imagined possible. The human mind is an incredible instrument. For 40 years, I used mine to teach teenagers about numbers and patterns. For 1 year, I used it to destroy 5 people who thought they could steal an innocent boy's life and get away with it. They were wrong. I'm sitting in a coffee shop, the same one I've been coming to for 20 years, when a young woman approaches my table. Mr. Ashford? William Ashford? I look up. She's maybe 30, professional, carrying a briefcase. I am. My name is Jennifer Torres. I'm a defense attorney in Chicago. I have a client, a young man, 25 years old, convicted of financial fraud. His family thinks he was framed. The evidence against him is all digital, all pristine, all too perfect. She sits down without being invited, and I see something in her eyes. Desperation. Hope. The same look my daughter had when she called me about Marcus, the lead investigator on the case. She continues, previously worked for the company my client allegedly stole from. The forensic expert who testified has connections to that same company. The prosecutor received campaign contributions from the company's CEO. I take a sip of my coffee. It's gone cold, but I don't mind. Why are you telling me this? Because I've read everything about your grandson's case. Every document on that website. I've studied your methodology. And I think the same thing happened to my client. You want my help? Yes. I look at her for a long moment. I'm 74 years old. I should be retired, enjoying my golden years, not getting involved in more conspiracy investigations. But then I think about Marcus, about that year he spent in prison for a crime he didn't commit. I think about how close we came to losing, how if I hadn't been smart enough, patient enough, determined enough, he'd still be there. And I think about all the other Marcus Ashfords out there. All the innocent people sitting in prison cells because someone with money and power decided to make them a scapegoat. I pull out my notebook, the same one I used to track the evidence against Henderson, and flip to a clean page. Tell me everything, I say. Start from the beginning. And don't leave anything out. The truth is always in the details. Jennifer Torres smiles, and it's like watching the sun come out from behind clouds. She begins to talk, and I begin to write. Because here's what I learned from this entire experience: the system isn't perfect. Justice isn't guaranteed. The powerful prey on the weak, and they do it with confidence because they rarely face consequences. But every conspiracy has a flaw. Every frame-up leaves evidence. Every criminal makes mistakes. And sometimes, just sometimes, an underestimated 74-year-old retired math teacher is exactly the person you need to bring it all crashing down. Game theory taught me that every player in a game makes decisions based on their perception of the other player's capabilities. Henderson, Brennan, Simmons, Foster, and Blackwood never saw me as a player. They thought I was a grieving grandfather, emotional and irrational. That was their fatal mistake. I was never emotional. I was never irrational. I was patient. I was thorough. I was cold as ice and sharp as a razor. And I won. Not because I was stronger. Not because I had more resources. But because I was smarter, more determined, and willing to play a longer game than they ever imagined possible. Remember this: the most dangerous opponent isn't the one who fights with strength, or money, or power. It's the one who fights with patience, intelligence, and absolute determination. The one you underestimate. The one you never see coming until it's too late. That's the lesson Richard Henderson learned. That's the lesson I taught him. And now, apparently, I'm going to teach it again.